Welcome to the Summit 2020 by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I'm joined here today by David Nabarro, who is the World Health Organization Director General's Special Envoy for COVID-19. David is a medical doctor who has a long career in public health, working with the World Health Organization and United Nations, particularly focused on food security and nutrition. David, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. We're delighted to have you. And I thought before we dive into the circular economy and discussions about broader global challenges, let's take a few moments to talk about COVID-19 and what we've learned. And one of the observations that many people make is that this was a challenge that was well known before it hit. And we have had extensive coverage in the press, in many journals over the last few years, warning of the possibility of a global pandemic. But then when it hit, we seem to be really a lot less ready for it than we should have been, and the response has been quite mixed. Could you take a few moments and reflect on where we are?
Thank you. Yes, of course. I started working on major disease outbreaks in 2005. I was brought into this by the Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, when we had a form of influenza that was affecting birds, and there was worry that it would jump species and lead to an influenza pandemic among humans. We were building on our recollection of previous influenza pandemics that have caused widespread loss of life. Plus, we were really worried about this one because it was such a nasty influenza virus. Why was there interest? That was because it was really countries in East Asia who had come together to ask for UN help, and they had experienced a really major outbreak of a disease called SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome, in 2003. Now, fast forward to now. We've been working hard on pandemic preparedness since 2005. We'd worked with many governments and also different parts of the United Nations. And there'd actually been quite a major global effort on pandemic preparedness. But somehow, since about 2014, this effort had wound down, and it had really wound down a lot during the last 3 years, to the point where come 2020, and we have a new and very serious pandemic, it almost appeared as though countries had forgotten what we'd been preparing for. But not every country and not every community. Throughout East Asia, we've seen many countries who've been well able to respond to the new coronavirus, almost as though they'd been preparing for it really for the last 10 years. These are the countries that experienced SARS in 2003. They include China, they include Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore, Taiwan, and other countries in the East Asia region. And that's because they have learned, and they've applied that learning, both in terms of what people have to do, what public health actors have to do, and what broader society has to do. So there has been learning, but it's patchy. There are many other countries and communities that appear not to have learned, despite the fact that they invested a lot of finance and political capital in pandemic preparedness. So in conclusion, I would say there has been some learning, but it's not widespread. And there are aspects of that learning that have been brilliant, but there are aspects of the learning that have somehow been forgotten.
And what does that tell you in terms of the way in which we approach, I guess, global challenges, whether they're health challenges or whether they're challenges such as climate change or biodiversity loss, or the issues that you're particularly interested in, food and nutrition? What do you take away from this really mixed global preparedness and our ability to come together around these big global issues?
And I think that question that you've just asked says it all. What is our ability to come together around big global issues? And of course, if you take some sections of every society, there is a real willingness to come together. As I work with people leading the response of sub-Saharan Africa to the impacts of climate change, I see enormous cooperation between countries, particularly in relation to promoting resilience in the face of climate threats. If I look at the coming together in the Pacific of Pacific Islands as they're thinking about how to respond to the threats of storm surges and hurricanes linked to climate change, they are working together like never before. Similarly for countries in the Caribbean, and also for actually quite a lot of Europe in responding to environmental and climate threats, for example, through the Green New Deal and the biodiversity strategy. So yes, there are all over the world examples of nations working together, of institutions cooperating, and of really effective preparedness. But it's incomplete because there are still some major nations in our world who perceive that they will do better if they adopt a competitive approach when dealing with global challenges rather than a cooperative approach.
It's interesting, the examples you bring up, because I would imagine that not many people are aware of the extent of these really quite effective and initiatives that are making real progress through this type of collaboration. Do you think it's an issue of really shining the light on these solutions more and actually working out how we can give them more prominence and start to think about how we can emulate those in other countries?
Well, most important is indeed to have the light shined on the success stories. Secondly, it's important that we enable people throughout the world who are focused on the value of cooperation to access this information and to take it on board. Just at the moment in global politics, there's quite a lot of emphasis on competition and dissent. There's not so much emphasis on harmony and collective working. And so that means that a lot of news media, including social media, as well as more formal print and broadcast media, tend to want to accentuate the discord, the disharmony, the fragmentation. And so it's necessary for organizations like the United Nations, where my main stable is, or the MacArthur Foundation, whose summit we're talking about now. These organizations need to be using whatever resources they've got to enable the groups of people who really want examples of cooperative behavior having impact, to have those to hand and to use them when they are spreading the news through their networks and nurturing broader cooperation for collective action that will help us deal with global threats.
And in your career, you would have seen many examples of really quite successful programs, particularly in the public health space. Things like polio and smallpox, etc. Again, from your experience looking at these types of initiatives where countries do come together very strongly, what's your sense of the role of the public and the private sector in these, in promoting these successful cases, in actually executing these successful cases?
Out of every 1,000 public sector actors, out of every 1,000 private sector actors, out of every 1,000 community level actors, the vast majority, let's say more than 990, are totally focused on the power of collaborative, collective action. The numbers who really want to work in a fragmented way are super small. But of course, they're the ones who also make a lot of noise. And they're the ones who sometimes command the headlines and indeed, I believe, perhaps support that is not always fully appreciating just what the separate and fragmented thinking actually does to societies. So there is success. I've seen it in public health, whether it's communicable diseases or what we call the non-communicable diseases like cancer, blood pressure, poor nutrition. I've seen it in agriculture and food. I've seen it in the application of nature to supporting climate action and resilience. I've seen it in every aspect of the Sustainable Development Agenda: education, water and sanitation, urban development. And the examples are just profound and numerous. So for me, the key issue is to make sure that everybody who's involved in working for a better future in the face of existential threats just holds on to the power of human energy, the human spirit, and the capacity that humanity has to work for improvements. It's not naivety. It's not false optimism. It's actually the reality. And the alternative position, the one that goes for competition, that tends to deride the capacity for collective action, that is actually the minority perspective. That's the one that we really need to recognize is not what is at the heart of human nature. And just constantly making that point is key, especially at the moment, with so many young people wondering, where is the North Star, the direction to try to follow? Well, it's staring us in the face. It's what people are doing everywhere.
It's really interesting that many of the challenges in the public health sector, whether it's nutrition, obesity, diabetes, etc., these are often referred to as system challenges because they're not the result of one single thing. They're a result of many aspects of a food system, for example. As we think about this need for collaboration, particularly to solve system challenges, we're seeing at the Foundation a real interest amongst the large organisations we're working with, and the recognition that individually they can't address these problems. Even the world's largest fast-moving consumer goods companies, for example, can't address the issue of plastics packaging waste. And for us, that's a really interesting, if you like, a demonstration of the need for different approaches for bringing together actors across the value chain or across different parts of the system to work together more effectively. As you're looking at many of the challenges that you're working on in food, for example, we can see in many of the global institutions and organisations a willingness to collaborate and work together. Are you also seeing this in the private sector, in the agricultural space, food space, etc.? Could you spend a few minutes talking about those sorts of examples?
Well, firstly, I want to really agree with the proposition you make that there is a greatly increasing number of organisations and institutions that want to do things different. Perhaps businesses are the ones who are shifting the fastest because they know that the future of their enterprises is not in any way positive and optimistic if humanity is headed into a series of collapses and difficulties because of the failures of the economic system that we have right now. Businesses know that long-term thriving and success depends on people being healthy, well-nourished, contented, able to have some prospect of prosperity, knowing that their children are going to get a decent education and a good long-term future. Nobody wants to be in a world where the prospects are grim simply because businesses can't work together or governments can't work together. So actually, business leaders have become some of the strongest advocates for new ways of doing things, and particularly for collective action based on the principles of circular economy. What the businesses are doing is that they're forming parts of partnerships and alliances that bring together public actors, private actors, community-based actors, scientists, media people, younger groups. And the businesses are saying, we can't do this alone. We have to be part of a collective. So networking together, being part of collectives, and creating unusual types of organizations with novel forms of government. That's what's happening all over the world. I'm seeing it everywhere. And I think the transformation is happening really fast. I think the state of global organization around these big issues is going to be unrecognizable in 5 years' time. We're going to see so many new forms of arrangement. The current situation of everybody squabbling and not working well together at the top political level between a few countries, I think that will go. The public everywhere don't want it. They're going to favor the companies and the leaders who go for collective action because they know that that's the only way they can guarantee a decent security and well-being for their children and their children's children.
That's brilliant. Thank you, David. Just to wrap up, I was just interested in your reflections over the last 8 months or so and the COVID virus coming in. You know, as you reflect on that and think about these global challenges, what are you most optimistic about? You've said many optimistic things so far, but is there anything that really stands out for you?
Well, yes. I mean, the COVID has shaken us all up. It's really caught us by surprise as a community, and it's shown us just how challenging these major existential threats can be. There have been so many interdependent knock-on effects because these are systems challenges. So COVID's affected employment, COVID's affected food and nutrition, COVID's affected governance, COVID's affected peace and security. It just touches everything. And what I think it's shown us is just how delicately balanced our systems are in the world today and how easily it is they can be knocked off kilter. But then as people have watched this, I'm also seeing a recognition that we have to work together to deal with the problem. And it takes a bit of time to make sense of what we've got to do. It isn't something that happens in the space of days or even weeks. It's months and it may be years to make sense of the impact of COVID. But I am seeing a recognition that, number one, if you have inequity and you have a virus like COVID, it hits the poorest, the weakest, the most deprived, hardest. And we all have to work together to deal with that. Secondly, we need the science and the cooperation of scientists to help us come together. So we've seen a massive outpouring of scientific cooperation. And thirdly, the one that's coming a bit slower, but it will come, is you need unity between outfits within countries and between nations if you're going to get a response. Taken time, but we've got political groups inside nations working together like never before, and we've got governments starting to work together. That's the slow part, but it's coming. I see the early signs, and that's why I retain an enormous degree of optimism. It's probably young people that are pushing the hardest. You read in the papers, young people are partying like crazy, they don't care about COVID. Don't believe that at all. Young people are super aware of what's going on. And yes, they may be partying quite a lot, but they're partying increasingly responsibly because they know that they've got to do everything possible to keep ourselves ahead of the virus so that we can avoid all of life being messed up by it.
David, thank you so much for taking time with us today. We very much appreciate it. We very much look forward to meeting you again in person soon. Thank you.
Thanks. Best wishes for the summit. Bye-bye.